Today we're going to paddle Salt Springs Run, the southernmost of 12 tidal creeks that flow into the Gulf of Mexico within the boundaries of Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park. This is, theoretically, a spring-fed stream, with sources at Salt Spring and Cauldron Spring, although there's been very little, if any, flow from these springs in recent years. Our kayak trip today, starting at Port Richey's Brasher Park, will take us into the mouth of Salt Springs Run, and then upstream from there. We'll visit both Cauldron Spring and Salt Spring, and take a detour or two along the way. The total time to do this paddle is probably about 2.5 hours for the round trip. But if you plan to make a few stops to enjoy the scenery or take photographs, as I'm going to do, plan on 3 to 4 hours. The tide is going to be rising as we paddle upstream, always a good idea when exploring these tidal creeks and lakes along this part of the Gulf Coast. Water is generally pretty shallow, and you sure don't want to get stranded with an outgoing tide and have to walk back. Tide levels for paddling Salt Spring Run aren't particularly critical, but there are a few spots where you'll need at least a couple of feet to get where you're going. Our start point will be Brasher Park at the west end of Coons Road in Port Richey. I love to launch from this little park. It's not usually crowded, has restrooms, and you can park right next to the kayak launch area. Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park will be opening a kayak launch soon that is much closer to the Springs area, but Brasher Park will continue to be one of the best spots to put in for access to the Gulf and the other tidal streams that are further north. This curious blue heron was watching as I prepared my kayak today. Just underway, and we're paddling out toward the Gulf. The structure you see to the right is a weather monitoring station set up and maintained by the University of South Florida. As you can see, the weather is near perfect, but there's a southwest breeze that's supposed to strengthen as the day goes on, and it may make it a little choppy on the way back. As I rounded the point at Brasher Park, I snapped a nice photo of this willet standing on the rocks. If you launch in early morning at low tide, you're likely to see roseate spoonbills feeding on the flats just to the south of Cow Key, which is that mangrove island in front of us. Now we're at the mouth of Salt Springs Run. Looking west toward the Gulf of Mexico, you can see a couple of the historic stilt houses that are about a mile offshore. They were originally built in the early 1900s. We've now paddled up Salt Springs Run about a half mile and are approaching the inlet of a small connector creek on the north bank. This winding passage can be used as a shortcut to the south branch of Double Hammock Creek, which is the stream immediately to the north of Salt Springs Run. But if you plan to take this shortcut, you'll need to watch the tides. At a low tide, it is too shallow, and you'll either have to turn back or drag your kayak across a rocky limestone creek bed for 100 feet or so. At high tide, there will be plenty of water. During tide changes, which is most of the time really, the current through here can be quite strong, flowing north to Double Hammock Creek on a rising tide and flowing south toward Salt Springs Run with an outgoing tide. Maneuvering the tight turns can be challenging, and is the reason this is called the Chute by locals. Did you see that great egret we just scared from his roost in the mangroves? You'll see lots of them in this area along the Gulf Coast, along with white ibis, herons, wood storks, oyster catchers, kingfishers, and a host of other shore and wading birds. Paddling against the current through here can be really challenging and can be a good cardio workout. So whether you're with the current or fighting it, only use this shortcut at almost dead high tide, unless you're an experienced paddler. I noticed as I was paddling through here that quite a few of the mangroves have been trimmed back. Looks like the park rangers at Werner-Boyce State Park are making a concerted effort to keep this passage clear for kayakers. The tidal creeks and lakes in Werner-Boyce are popular with fishermen, and while some will be fishing from a kayak, most of them use powerboats. So as you're paddling, be sure to watch for traffic. Of particular concern are airboats, which are common in these parts. There are a number of airboat paths that connect between streams and lakes, and it would be easy to get caught off guard if you paddle through one of them. Luckily, you can hear airboats coming a long way off. The chute is not one of those passageways that airboats can maneuver. It's a natural channel that is way too curvy for anything other than kayaks and canoes. You may have noticed that the tide is pretty high. It should be cresting in about a half hour, so we're paddling with a slight current, but we'll have no trouble when we turn around to go back. After turning around and emerging from the chute into Salt Springs Run again, we're now continuing upstream. There's a large building on the right known as the Energy and Marine Center, or EMC for short. Even though it's immediately adjacent to the state park, it's actually owned by the Pasco County School Board. Surrounded by salt marsh, mangroves, and oyster bars, it provides classrooms and laboratories for teaching kids about coastal ecology and marine ecosystems. Currently, all Pasco County 4th graders attend the Marine Explorer program here, and middle schoolers participate in a Watershed Ambassadors program. The center has a whole fleet of kayaks that can be used for field trips, and it's not uncommon to run into a group of a dozen or so tandem kayaks paddling every which way and bumping into each other as the kids try to master a new skill while paddling to the springs. Here you can get a good view of the EMC in its network of boardwalks and piers. Note that this area is for school and student use only. You're not allowed to dock or disembark onto EMC grounds. After paddling across a small bayou, we're now approaching the future kayak launch site for Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park. Construction is still underway at this point, but eventually they should have a complete handicap-accessible kayak ramp allowing easy access to Salt Springs Run. I decided to pull up here for a few minutes to have a look around and see how things are coming along. Continuing upstream, we're now heading into what I think is the most scenic portion of Salt Springs Run, and for that matter, of the entire state park. The stream narrows significantly, and the current begins to move a little faster. While we're paddling this section, let me tell you a bit about Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park. The park extends along the Gulf Coast from just north of where we launched today, almost all the way to Hudson Beach. That's a stretch of about 4 miles of coastal marshes, tidal streams, and lakes that the park includes. Considering the development all along and to the east of US 19, this protected land was an important acquisition by the state of Florida, not only in providing a watershed area for runoff from the build-up areas, but in preserving a coastal barrier to the threat of hurricanes and tropical storms. Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park was officially established in the year 2000. Consisting of about 4,000 acres along the Gulf Coast, it is home to at least 11 other named and unnamed coastal streams. One of the most notable of these is Hope Bayou, where you'll find a remote shelter that is an official waypoint on the Florida Circumnavigational Saltwater Paddling Trail. There's a lot of exploring to do here. Salt Springs Run is only the beginning if you're an avid kayaker. You see that gnarly tree in front of us? If you think you've seen it before, it may be because that's an iconic landmark along this stream. And photos of the tree can be seen on the State Park website, as well as the homepage of Salt Springs Alliance, the citizen support organization for the park. We've just now arrived at a fork in Salt Springs Run. The branch running to the left has its source at Salt Spring, and the branch going to the right will take us to Cauldron Spring. At a low tide, much of what you currently see covered in water is an exposed limestone outcropping and oyster bed, making it difficult, if not impossible, to paddle to Cauldron Spring. But there's plenty of water right now, so that's where we're headed first. The creek running from Cauldron Spring that we're paddling on right now, like other streams within the park, has a flow that is mostly tidal. In other words, when the tide comes in, the flow is toward the spring, and when the tide recedes, the flow is toward the Gulf. The spring itself contributes very little, if anything, to this flow. But after a heavy rainstorm, or during the rainy season, a substantial amount of fresh water flows into the stream as runoff from Port Richey and Highway 19. This makes the water brackish. You can see the influence of this mix of fresh and salt water by observing the plants along this creek. In the section where we are now, you see mostly black needlerush, which loves salt water. But as we paddle further upstream toward the source of the spring and the freshwater runoff, you'll begin to see giant leather fern and grasses that prefer freshwater but are saltwater tolerant. Over at the right here, you can see the top of the new observation deck and restroom building that is currently under construction in the day use area of the state park. There are currently 3 public access points to the park. One is located at the west end of State Road 52. At that location, there's a short trail you can hike that takes you onto the Salt Flats. Another entrance is along Scenic Drive on the eastern boundary of the park. There you'll find restrooms, a small picnic area, and a half-mile loop trail that extends into a densely forested hammock. The main entrance is on US 19, just north of Ridge Road, and we'll be paddling close to that area, so more on that later. For the moment, I'm just going to quit talking for a bit and let you enjoy the scenery as we continue to paddle up to Cauldron Spring. As we approach this last turn, we're just about at the end of our journey to Cauldron Spring. Notice how the needlerush has given away almost completely to ferns and other freshwater plants along the banks. Even though you can't see it, the main parking lot for the State Park day use area is just to our right. In the distance ahead of us, you can see a culvert and railing across the stream. All of the water coming through that culvert is rainwater runoff from lands further east. The opening of Cauldron Spring is under the water just to the left of the culvert, but you can't see it from the surface. Divers have explored the spring and found a large cave room with a passage that runs for a short distance before coming to an obstruction. Note that recreational scuba diving is not allowed in the springs at Werner-Boyce State Park. Now it's time to head back downstream to the place where we turned right at the fork. Then we'll be on our way to Salt Spring. Now we're paddling upstream again, but this time we're following the left branch of Salt Spring Run. You'll notice that there's more current here than there was in the branch that led to Cauldron Spring. That's not because there's more flow coming from Salt Spring, because neither of these springs has much, if any, water discharge. And it's not because the stream leading to Salt Spring has a higher rainwater runoff. The reason there's more current is simply because there's a longer distance to the spring, and there's a good-sized tidal lake upstream from the spring. So there's a lot more water coming down this branch of Salt Springs Run. Along the right bank, you can see a nice covered picnic table that was recently installed. You'll find these in a number of places along the hiking trails in the park. The trail that runs along the shore here is named the Springs Trail, for obvious reasons. If you're a bird watcher or photographer, you also find a few strategically placed birding platforms along the trails overlooking the marsh areas. Look in the top of those mangroves, and you'll see a couple more great egrets. This is such a good place for bird watching. Usually you can see osprey flying overhead and chirping if you're out here for a while. And if you're lucky, you might catch one of Werner-Boyce's resident bald eagles, who have a nest near the main entrance. For a better view, you can take the eagle hiking trail that starts at the south side of the main parking lot. We just came around the last turn on our way to Salt Spring and entered a fairly large bayou. Along the north side of the bayou are a few houses that are at the end of Salt Spring Road. A little difficult to see them from here. The entrance to the spring is right in front of us, but unless you know what you're looking for, it would be hard to find. It appears that those fishermen in the boat up ahead know about it though. I suspect they're trying to catch fish as they enter or leave the spring. If you paddle the route we've taken at a lower tide, it would be hard to believe that a motorboat this size could get back here. But it is possible at high tide. Only fishermen who are fools or who know the area well will try it. If you don't time the tides correctly, you could end up getting stranded here and have to wait for the next high to get out. Now you can begin to make out a small opening in the mangroves where the spring run emerges. Getting through here takes a bit of maneuvering. This is where a short paddle would come in handy. I knew when we launched that there would be a high tide at this point, but the westerly wind has made it extra high. This is about as much water as I've seen here, and headroom might be a problem. If you paddle in here at low tide, it has a completely different look with limestone outcroppings and ledges along the banks. Oops, let's back up and try that again. There we go. Normally, branches in the face are not the problem. It's having enough water underneath you. We're just 100 or 200 feet downstream from Salt Spring right now, and in this area there are two limestone arches separated by about 60 feet. At low tide, the water flows under the arches, and the tops of the arches are out of water, making it impossible to go further in a kayak. If park rangers catch you dragging your boat across those arches, you would be shown the exit very quickly. At high tide, like now, water flows over the arches, and it's possible to paddle all the way to the spring. Salt Spring has a long history, much of it disputed or still a mystery. It's fairly well known and documented that salt was produced in this general area during the Civil War through a process of boiling and evaporation of salt water. Some historians believe that the outflow from this spring had higher than usual salt content and that the salt works were centered at Salt Spring. But there's no evidence that proves this was the location of the salt works. Nevertheless, it's interesting to speculate about. As for Salt Spring itself, there's no doubt that it's an impressive spring, even if it doesn't have much flow anymore. Several scientifically conducted dives have been done at this site, and they've discovered that Salt Spring has several huge underground caves and extends to a depth of at least 320 feet, making it one of the deepest underwater cave systems known. The state park only allows divers who are conducting scientific research to enter the spring due to the extreme danger involved. We're now upstream from the spring, and just around this bend it opens into a fairly large circular tidal lake. Even though it feels like we're deep in the wilderness, we're really only a few hundred yards from US 19. Do you see those light poles way off in the distance? Those are the lights in the parking lot of Gulfview Square Mall. We've come to the end of our tour of Salt Springs Run, Cauldron Spring, and Salt Spring. Altogether, the distance we've traveled has been about 2¼ miles. Our trip back will only be about 1.5 miles since we won't be taking any side trips. I hope you enjoyed this short tour of Salt Springs Run, where we condensed a 3-hour paddle into about 23 minutes. For more information about Werner-Boyce Salt Springs State Park and other places to explore on the Nature Coast of Florida, visit our website at floриданaturecoast.org.